After his stint studying new physics theory at the University of Göttingen as suggested by Niels Bohr, J. Robert Oppenheimer meets Isidor Rabi in Holland. On Rabi's insistence, Oppenheimer sets forth to meet fellow German Werner Heisenberg. While this was the only time Oppenheimer and Heisenberg met in person, the war ensured their paths crossed in the future. In America, Oppenheimer begins teaching quantum mechanics. Beginning with just one student, Lomenitz, at Berkeley, the class slowly grows with time. Oppenheimer strikes a friendship with nuclear physicist Ernest Lawrence at Berkeley too. Despite Lawrence warning him to keep his political ties away from class, Oppenheimer couldn't seem to stay away from Communist Party meetings. It is at one such party that he meets professor of French literature, Håkon Chevalier. After news of a German nuclear fission procedure, Oppenheimer realizes what theory can accomplish in practice. Discussing the consequences of a potential chain reaction in this situation, the idea of a bomb first comes into being. In order to be included in the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer willingly cuts all his political ties on Lawrence's insistence. It was then that Oppenheimer went through an initial security check and was assured that any prior communist involvement will not be a hurdle for him. This becomes a point of huge debate during his security hearing in 1954 as to why was he granted security clearance in the first place when he had communist roots and relations. Admiral Strauss insists during his confirmation hearing in 1959 that he wasn't the one that brought charges against Oppenheimer, but it was well-known anti-communist William Borden instead, who somehow had full access to FBI's security file on Oppenheimer. For the project, Colonel Leslie Groves offers to recruit Oppenheimer as the project director, despite knowing of his communist and womanizing ways. Oppenheimer informs Groves that Hitler's hate for the Jews might actually be America's only hope. He explains that since Heisenberg is the only one who has the necessary knowledge to tackle quantum physics, he has to be the one leading their progress. Additionally, he hopes that Hitler wouldn't have provided him with enough resources for his work, which would render their head start somewhat meaningless. With the development of the town of Los Alamos in New Mexico, Oppenheimer and Groves set about recruiting the brightest minds and the best scientists they can find. Further, not only does Rabi agree to join his friend, he even suggests getting Hans Bethe to run the theoretical physics department. During a meeting with the scientists that would work together at Los Alamos, Edward Teller brings to everyone's notice that the growth of the chain reaction could possibly be exponential. To confirm these potentially dangerous calculations, Oppenheimer seeks the expertise of Albert Einstein at Princeton. Einstein agrees with Oppenheimer that an atomic device with an exponential chain reaction would lead to the destruction of the world. Einstein's advice at this was to have Bethe work out the calculations and to immediately inform the Nazis if they were right about the consequential destruction. Back at Berkeley, Bethe's calculations show that the possibility of an uncontrolled nuclear reaction would be near zero. One night, Chevalier mentions to Oppenheimer of having met Eltonton of the Federation. He had let slip to Chevalier that he could assist in passing on information to the Soviets if such a service was needed. At his hearing in 1954, Oppenheimer clarifies that while he should have reported Eltonton right away, it was thought impossible for Chevalier to have known anything about his work. At a meeting at Los Alamos, Edward Teller tries to come up with a plan to solve the problem of needing more refined uranium and plutonium. He says that instead of a fission bomb that would require huge quantities of uranium and plutonium, they should look to using heavy hydrogen or deuterium to create a fusion bomb induced by a small fission bomb to fuse hydrogen atoms. This way the energy released won't just be several kilotons, but megatons instead, pointing out that since this will also require more uranium or plutonium than they currently have, Oppenheimer shelves this idea. After the war, with news of the Soviets being in possession of a bomb, Strauss insists that if Teller's hydrogen bomb had the capacity to put America back in the race, then they should definitely consider the option. The possibility of a spy at Los Alamos having made this information available to the Russians made the hydrogen bomb even more attractive. At Los Alamos, realizing that obtaining a security clearance was important to remain updated, Oppenheimer confronts Grover and demands that he be granted the clearance. At Oppenheimer's hearing later, Groves confirms that it was because of his insistence that Oppenheimer was granted the necessary security clearance. The presence of communists at Los Alamos continues to make Strauss doubt everything about the place, since despite compartmentalization being the protocol, everyone knew everything anyway. Oppenheimer's first student, Lomenitz, even gets drafted for fear of communist infiltration. When Oppenheimer drops Eltonton's name in an attempt to get him out, he meets Colonel Posh. Unknown to Oppenheimer, he was already wary of his communist ties. Oppenheimer attempted having Posh look up Eltonton without mentioning Chevalier's name, but Groves tells him later that it might not have been enough. Oppenheimer does not give up Chevalier's name to either Posh or Groves right away. But when he did come clean to Groves a few months later, Groves had Posh transferred to London in order to investigate the Nazi bomb. Niels Bohr arrived at Los Alamos with a warning for Oppenheimer. He says that nobody is prepared to deal with the consequences with whatever will come after this nuclear attack. Calling him the American Prometheus, he also urges him to convince the politicians that his work would give way to a completely new world. Oppenheimer had to then stop a frustrated Teller from leaving Los Alamos. He allowed him to continue working on his research for the fusion bomb and promised to meet him for an hour every week for regular updates. Despite this, Oppenheimer continued to see impracticalities of the hydrogen bomb even after the war. This also becomes a point of discussion at his hearing. He clarifies then that the Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission submitted their recommendation to the president to stop the development of this weapon. It was discussed in detail that in comparison to an atomic bomb, a hydrogen bomb would potentially be 1,000 times stronger. Oppenheimer met William Borden at this meeting, but the conversation was cut short by Oppenheimer himself. Borden later filed his indictment against Oppenheimer. At the hearing, Edward Teller maintains that he believes in Oppenheimer's loyalty for the country. When it was believed that Germany would soon be surrendering after Hitler's death, the continued need for research for a bomb was questioned. Oppenheimer was of the opinion that even if Germany surrendered, Japan was still going strong, and unless they were shown what America was capable of doing, they would neither understand the impact nor fear them. He insisted that the global peace that will follow such an attack will be exactly the kind that Roosevelt wanted. In a meeting with Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, Oppenheimer brings to attention the fact that while the atomic bomb may cause fewer deaths than the Tokyo firestorm that took 100,000 lives, its impact was not to be underestimated. He does so on Stillard's insistence because of his belief about Japan's inability to last on her own without Germany. Stimson, on the other hand, mentions that he has intelligence that Japan will not surrender. Knowing that this situation will cause more deaths, he moves on to the list of Japanese cities that will cause the most impact. Groves agrees to a test in July to enable President Truman an option to involve the Soviet with them, purely to win the war. Preparations for the Trinity test begin with the arrival of Oppenheimer's brother Frank at Los Alamos. Using his knowledge of the desert, he plans the location of the test for minimum damage and also the safe distances from which to observe. The test bomb is built and positioned only for adverse weather to push its detonation to 5:30 a.m. on the 16th of July. With its successful detonation, Oppenheimer realizes the true power of the words of the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, destroyer of the worlds." Celebrations after the test prove the worth of the efforts of everyone involved with the Manhattan Project, even as Groves relays the news to the president. Desperately for any information of the bombs on the 6th of August, Oppenheimer listens to President Truman's speech on the radio along with Los Alamos about 16 hours after the drops happened. Groves calls to appreciate Oppenheimer's effort, and the entire town of Los Alamos celebrates Oppenheimer for having pulled off the biggest gamble. After being named the father of the atomic bomb, Oppenheimer takes his opportunity during his meeting with President Truman to inform him of the potential arms race with the Soviets. He also honestly lets the president know that he feels responsible for all the deaths in Japan, to which Truman somewhat rudely replies that it was his decision to drop the bombs and not Oppenheimer's. After the war, while almost everyone around Oppenheimer was shunned from academia and society, he continued to influence the country towards arms control instead of the hydrogen bomb. According to Strauss, Truman's rejection of the recommendation of the Advisory Committee shocked and upset Oppenheimer. He also recalls informing Oppenheimer about the Soviet spy at Los Alamos, as he had always thought, following which the FBI's investigation into Oppenheimer began afresh. But none of it scared him, and he continued expressing his views wherever he could. Borden's accusations led to Oppenheimer losing everything, including his security clearance. And once again, Oppenheimer informs Teller of not supporting him any longer. Soon after, he leaves Los Alamos as well. In further preparation for his hearing, Oppenheimer discusses his chances on the basis of how much Borden has Teller under his influence. His wife, Kitty, insists that it had to have been Strauss who was responsible for everything, but Oppenheimer refuses to believe her. It so happens that it was indeed Strauss who orchestrated everything against Oppenheimer beginning with providing Borden with all the necessary material. Further, he made sure that a closed-room bureaucratic procedure would be arranged instead of a public trial for when Oppenheimer appeals the renewal of his security clearance. And exactly as predicted, Oppenheimer files an appeal despite knowing very well that the fight would be far from fair. Oppenheimer's defense counsel was denied access to files referred to in the hearing since they were classified information. And it comes to light that Oppenheimer's meeting with Posh had an audio recording. While Isadora, Robbie, and Groves come through for Oppenheimer and testify to his character and loyalty, Borden's letter to the FBI makes things difficult as it accused Oppenheimer himself to have been a Soviet spy. At the confirmation hearing with Strauss, on the other hand, Dr. Hill comes through for Oppenheimer when he reveals how most of America's scientists want Strauss to have nothing to do with the government. He details that Strauss found a bunch of people who also disagreed with Oppenheimer and put them together to carry out an unfair closed hearing, all for the purpose of proving Oppenheimer guilty of espionage. Dr. Bush also stands in favor of Oppenheimer, saying that everything that Oppenheimer is being put through is unfair treatment for someone who just happens to have strong opposing views from the general opinion. Groves states that he has no doubt about Oppenheimer's loyalty whatsoever, but also mentions that he may not have renewed his clearance if he had to go by the terms present now, which were not in force in the past when he granted the clearance. Kitty is asked a lot about her connections to the Communist Party. Realizing the attempts to completely disregard her, she answers boldly that she has had nothing to do with the party for the past 18 years. She also clearly states that while her husband gave some money to Spanish refugees and entertained some ideas of communism, none of that made him a communist either. Einstein meets Oppenheimer one night and suggests that he stop this torture of the hearing if that's what America is offering in return for all his efforts. Oppenheimer replies that he loves the country and cannot find it in himself to turn his back on it. The confirmation hearing turns into a trial because of Hill, and that causes some stress in the Strauss camp. He continues to believe that Oppenheimer wanted all the glory for himself and manipulated all scientists against him, beginning with Einstein. He based this assumption on the conversation between Oppenheimer and Einstein that he observed from afar. Meanwhile, Oppenheimer had to clarify how and why he went from supporting the hydrogen bomb to being against its use. He says that the country's decision to make these weapons at all costs without concern to anything else swayed him because he knew the mass destruction it would cause and the consequences that would follow. Another point of anger for Strauss is that Oppenheimer never expressed his regret over Hiroshima and his staunch belief that given another chance, Oppenheimer would do it all again because it made him the most important man around. Oppenheimer is also made to defend his selection of the locations of the bombings, knowing how many civilians would be killed or injured. He is then bullied into answering whether or not he would have supported dropping a hydrogen bomb on Japan as against the atomic bomb. He kept trying to say that he was simply doing his job and he didn't endorse even an atomic bomb, but to no avail. While the hearing concludes that Oppenheimer is loyal to the country, his appeal for the renewal of his security clearance is declined. Strauss is denied his confirmation due to 3 holdouts, one of whom was John F. Kennedy, a junior senator from Massachusetts at the time. A bitter Strauss continues to be delusional about Oppenheimer having manipulated scientists against him. It is brought to his notice that since it cannot be confirmed what that conversation was about between Oppenheimer and Einstein that Strauss witnessed, it was possible that the two spoke about something completely different. Revealed at the very end, this conversation was indeed nothing about Strauss and everything about Oppenheimer himself. Einstein rightly predicted that Oppenheimer will be honored with a medal, and everyone would congratulate him only after enough time had passed and he had been punished enough. Their conversation ends when Oppenheimer refers to when he had consulted Einstein with calculations of the bomb and concluded that it could cause the destruction of the world. He tells Einstein that he truly believes that the bomb brought about the indirect destruction of the world through the various consequences and technological advances made that followed. So guys, please like and share the video and also subscribe Recap Pro for more upcoming movie recap videos.